to the Happy Lawyer Project. I'm your host, Akoma Moronu, and I created this show to help lawyers find happiness in life with a law degree. Together with my guest, we provide the knowledge, skills, insight, inspiration, and encouragement you need to find your happy. Last week, I had the pleasure of sharing my conversation with Elena Deutsch. We chatted about what it takes to find career clarity and to set personal goals that bring more things into your life that will spark joy. It was a wonderful, nourishing conversation, and I think that you guys would really enjoy it if you missed that one. This week, I chat with Kara Loewentheil. She's a former attorney, certified master coach, and fellow podcast host over at the Lawyer Stress Solution. I get super vulnerable with Kara today as she helps me work through one of the things that I continue to struggle with as a young lawyer growing in my own career. We chat about her personal journey as an attorney and her struggles to manage stress, expectations, anxiety, and how coaching changed her life. I think there's a lot that you guys will get from this episode, so I hope you guys enjoy. Welcome back to the Happy Lawyer Project. Kara, I'm so happy to finally have you on. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. I'm super excited to be here.
So before we dive into what you do, could you start briefly by describing who you are and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you know, my name is Kara Loewentheil is my last name, and I live in Manhattan in the East Village. And I was raised by a family of lawyers. So I was been kind of a lawyer in training my whole life. And then I went to law school, which was pretty expected. And I was in the reproductive rights movement. So I clerked on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit on the Federal Appeals Court. And then I was a reproductive rights litigator. And I was pretty miserable that whole time. I was, already a little bit of an anxious person before I went to law school, which is not uncommon. And then law school was very intense for me, as it was for many people, and pretty stressful. And then I clerked, and that was also quite stressful for me. And then I litigated, and sort of becoming a litigator and going through the litigation fellowship I had was kind of my first rubber hits the road moment, where I had been working towards this job as a goal for so long. And then I got it, and then I did not enjoy it, and I didn't want to keep doing it. And so I thought maybe academia would be better for me. So I decided to become an academic, and I did a legal fellowship, like an academic fellowship at Yale. And then I did a fellowship at Columbia, where I sort of ended up running a think tank. And kind of all along the way, though, what I was learning was that there was kind of no job out there, no brass ring that was going to be the thing that suddenly made me feel happy and complete and good enough. And so after I left litigation, and while I was starting my academic journey, I also was starting reading more and more about psychology and self-help and evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology and, therapeutic models and all sorts of stuff, trying to kind of understand what was going on in my brain and why I felt so stressed out and insecure and like an impostor and all that good stuff that so many lawyers, especially women lawyers, feel. And then, it all just kind of came together in a confluence. It was time to go on the market to get a teaching job, to get a law professor job. And that was really a decision point. Was I going to do that or not? And at the same time, I had worked with a couple of coaches, and I had started learning more about coaching. And I sort of decided that now was the time to make the jump. And so went and got certified as a coach, and actually I'm now a master certified coach, and started my own coaching practice. So that's the journey in a nutshell. And I think my parents have mostly recovered by this point.
I love that you say you were raised by a group of lawyers. It makes it sound like you were raised by wolves.
Exactly. It's like very argumentative wolves. That's what it was.
Can we chat a little about the initial books you read? Because I went through a similar process myself, where when I was going through kind of that figuring stuff out phase, I turned to research. And I am also fascinated in neuroplasticity and, all those types of things. So I'm really excited to dive into that with you. And I'd be interested to know what books you turned to early on in your process.
Yeah, I should be honest with you that I am the worst at remembering titles and
Fair
names. So I can see them on my bookshelf. I actually started my coaching reading with more sort of traditional life coaches like Martha Beck. Martha Beck was really important to me even less because of what she taught, but because I had this sort of pull towards coaching. And it was funny when I became a coach and I told a friend that I hadn't seen in a while and I expected them to be shocked. And they were like, oh, well, you've been saying you want to do that for years. And I was like, what? No, I haven't. This is like a new thing. And they said, no, you're always sort of joking that you're going to like move to Costa Rica and become a life coach. So it was like I had been germinating this without being totally conscious of it. And so Martha Beck was really important to me because she's a PhD from Harvard, right? So it was really legitimizing for me. Like I come from this family of Jewish lawyers and doctors, right? So being a life coach was not one of the accepted menu items when I was growing up. And my parents are great and very supportive now, but I definitely had to overcome some of my own like internal biases about this stuff. And so seeing that Martha had this incredible education similar to my education, I went to Harvard for law school, and that like a serious intellectual person could have a job in this world, that was actually quite important to me. And I also learned a ton from my teacher, Brooke Castillo.
Brooke is fantastic. She's phenomenal.
Yeah. Brooke is amazing. She is a force of nature. Not so much her books, actually. She has not written a ton of books, but she has a podcast, which is great, called the Life Coach School podcast. So I think those were two of the really formative ones. And in terms of the neuroscience, there isn't like one book that comes to mind. I read a bunch of books on sort of habit formation along the way that I think were kind of my entree. But of course, I'm blanking on the names. One is like Slow Habit Change. I could look them up and send them to you. But anyway, so that's kind of where I started.
I love the parallels because for me, it was Gretchen Rubin, and for similar reasons, because she was also a lawyer.
Yes.
I felt like that legitimized her perspective for me because she understood, like if she was looking for happiness and she came from this industry of law where we're so depressed and unhappy and anxious, like her quest would be similar to mine, and whatever she did that worked could possibly work for me.
Yeah, I actually read, that's a good reminder. I read Gretchen Rubin's stuff early on and had a similar thing. Of course, I was still, to me, it was like, okay, well, she got like a major book deal, so that's okay. It's like I still had to baby step my way towards like it's okay to be a life coach. But yeah, I definitely remember reading that and being like, okay, she's a Supreme Court clerk and she decided not to be a lawyer and she's thinking about happiness and psychology. Like that's something you can do. Yeah, I love her work, and she was also formative for me in that way.
So one of the things that we've kind of touched on a little here, and I'd like for you to talk a little bit more about, is the idea of lawyer brain and what that is, how it plays out in our day-to-day lives, and why, if you can answer, why it is.
Yeah, totally. So lawyer brain is a funny concept because I think that a lot of us lawyers have an intuitive sense of what it is. Like I've never said lawyer brain to a lawyer and had them say like, I don't know what you mean. Right? Like we have this sense that we think a little differently than like the average bear, like the non-lawyer civilians. But I really look at it as having this very specific meaning, which is it's the way that your brain is trained to think in law school and then is encouraged to continue thinking during your legal practice. And I break it down into a couple of different kind of heuristics or frameworks or mental habits, but the three that I think are the most important are catastrophizing, which is always thinking about the worst possible outcome, always worrying about what might happen, and kind of going straight there. Like lawyers are amazing at being like, I stubbed my toe, I'm going to have to amputate my leg.
Yep.
Right? Like, that's where it goes. And that sounds silly, but they do the equivalent thing with their job, right? Like on my review, they said I should turn around assignments faster. I'm going to end up living alone in a van by the river. Like that's, straight to the worst case scenario. So that's catastrophizing. Also adversarialness, which oddly enough, a lot of lawyers are actually quite terrified of conflict. So I don't mean adversarialness in the sense of like you're a really aggressive person, but it's really a very subtle kind of frame with which you see the world where you always feel like you're either like on defense or need to be attacking. Like nobody can say anything without you thinking that you either need to like logically pick it apart or see where it might be wrong, or that them disagreeing with you means like there's something wrong with what you're saying and you're in trouble. So that's sort of thinking of ourselves even unconsciously as being sort of opposed to other people is adversarialness for me. And then the third one is trouble spotting, what I call trouble spotting, borrowed from what you learn one all year. But when you're always looking for something that might be out of place, it can almost turn into like a paranoia. and getting sort of obsessively over-analytical about small inconsistencies or things that might seem out of place. So you're constantly scanning for like what might be wrong, what's a sign that something might be wrong, etc. So those are kind of the three main types of lawyer brain that I work on and see with my clients. Does that all make sense?
Oh my gosh. Not only does it make so much sense, but I can see that personality type in so many of the lawyers that I know. I've worked on it myself for a very long time, so less myself these days, but I definitely, especially when I interact with my husband, the adversarial one is the challenge for me. And not in the ways I think people would expect, because the more obvious ones I've worked on, I think it's way more subtle now. And for me, it's almost this like when he includes facts for a story that are unnecessary, I feel the need to point that out. And I'm like, why am I saying this? Like, this is not making him feel good. It doesn't make me look like a good person, but like, I need him to know that that detail was excessive and like boring to me.
You're like, listen, I love you, but I need to redline your story.
Yeah, I'm just like, why did you tell me that part?
Yeah, I totally agree. And, you know, I've become more and more interested in the adversarialness, although it's the thing that is the least present when I immediately work with clients, because I think a lot of us, especially women who are socialized to not be aggressive, the adversarialness takes a different form and it almost gets combined with this sort of sense of your own. If you have the sense of inadequacy or inferiority, it can actually combine with adversarialness in this interesting way where you're sort of always thinking that the other person is about to like find out there's something wrong with you or thinks there's something wrong with you. And then you're sort of like opposed to that. So for myself too, I notice really subtle ways of like, when someone says something, I just can watch my brain. It immediately wants to be like, now let me distill from their normal human story, whatever logical proposition they're trying to make, and then take it to an extreme and then see if I can dispute it. Right? Like that's something lawyer brain does. It's not always that helpful to a normal conversation.
So I'm going to make an argument, and you can tell me if you agree. But I think part of this also comes from this idea that being critical, analytical, and being able to spot holes in complex like stories or whatever the case may be, cases is seen as smart, whereas being agreeable is almost seen as being gullible. And so we kind of associate, I think even in society, before we become lawyers, I think lawyers just kind of take it to a whole nother level. But I think we think of critical thinking as being critical in our thinking.
Yeah, and I think it's probably true that is true society-wide. I do think lawyers, like as you said, it's a whole other level because that's what you're taught in law school is we're going to make you special by teaching you how to be a critical thinker, and that's how you show you're smart, right? When in fact, like, yes, being critical in that way is a useful tool, but if that's the only thing you know how to do, right? It's like when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? There are other forms of intelligence that you're not developing and you're not using. And that really can impact not just your personal life, but your professional life, right? So when I work with clients who are higher up, right, who are partners or who are the general counsel of a big company or something, one of the things I often work with them on is the idea of broadening their idea of like, what's the point of a conversation? Like the point of a conversation is not always to achieve at the most logically accurate, efficient solution immediately. Right? Like, because when you think that, you don't pay attention to all the other functions conversation serves. Sometimes conversation is a way for two human beings to bond and show interest in each other, right? Sometimes conversation is a way for an underling to show that they're committed to their work or that they have some skill or characteristic that they think is valuable and for you to acknowledge that. Like conversation serves various other functions, not just let's arrive at the correct, most logically rigorous solution immediately.
I feel like that was a subtle dig at me for critiquing my husband's stories.
No, not at all. I was thinking of one specific client I had. Actually.
That's funny.
No, not at all.
So people have lawyer brain and you work with them, to reprogram their brains, I would call it. What kind of skills do they use to do that?
Yeah. I like to talk about kind of retraining your brain, which is just, is somewhat semantics, but part of it is like, if a lot of my clients want to keep being lawyers, so like you do need to keep these skills, right? We're not trying to like erase that part of the hard drive, to use the kind of computer metaphor. But what I'm really teaching people to do is how to notice when they're using that part of their brain and then decide on purpose whether to use it or not, right? So you can use it when you're drafting a contract. Yes, let's think about everything that could go wrong. Let's maybe not use it when the person that you're dating doesn't text you with as many exclamation points as usual, right? Like let's learn how to turn it on and off. And in terms of how you do that, I think the thing that makes coaching work and that makes meditation work and that makes therapy work is this fundamentally kind of unexplainable thing about human consciousness, which is the ability to observe itself, right? The ability to watch your own thought practice or thought process. Like the state of being what Buddhists would call the watcher. There's a part of you that can observe your own thinking. And that is kind of where it all starts. And so what I teach people to do is I teach people how to become aware of what they're thinking. Most of us have no idea what we're thinking at any given moment. And I teach people how to differentiate that from how they feel and what the relationship is between their thoughts and their feelings. And then I teach people how to change their thinking, like how to think on purpose and think in a different way. Does that answer your question?
It does. And that transitions really nicely into kind of something I've been struggling with that I would love to get your thoughts on.
Yeah, let's do it.
So I have worked with a lot of coaches. I love working with coaches. And I know that Brooke Castillo talks about this herself, about kind of the stories we tell ourselves and the gremlins and all those things, the inner critic that keeps us from reaching our full potential or achieving, what we're trying to achieve in our life. And I think of these as kind of these stories that I've inherited. And I don't know if that's the terminology you use or if you use that in your practice at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, story, thought, all the same. Sure.
Yeah. And so one of the stories that I struggle with, did you ever read Carol Dweck's Mindset, the growth mindset and the fixed mindset?
Oh, I'm familiar with those concepts. I don't think I've read the book, but I know about growth versus fixed mindsets. Yeah.
So I very much had a fixed mindset growing up, have worked very hard to have a growth mindset now.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing I struggle with is because I think that the value is doing the work, I think that only things that are hard work have value.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So when something comes easy to me or something feels too easy, it feels like I must not be doing it right.
Mm-hmm.
Or
specific example.
So I just transitioned to a new job and some parts of the job just feel easy. Do you know what I mean? And then I'm like, well, I must not be doing this right. Like I must not be catching stuff. I must not be reviewing these documents correctly or understanding the assignment.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is clearly too easy.
Okay. Yeah, this is something it's super common. In fact, Brooke herself has coached me about this. So I'm going to pass that on to you.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
What you got?
I just finished my master coach certification with Brooke, and I got coached about this during our last group meeting, in fact, because I have the same thing. A lot of things came easily to me. That's how I got through school and law school and did well without, with like doing things at the last minute and all the rest. And so I was always sort of telling myself, right, it should be harder. Or what I would tell myself, and you can tell me if this is something you think also, is like, well, if I can do a good job without really trying, then I could do an amazing job if I did try hard, and I should beat myself up about that.
Yes. No, absolutely. Yeah. Like if I tried harder, then I would be even better.
Yeah.
But I'm too lazy.
Yeah. So you have the thought that you're lazy.
But right? It also is like almost a thought that I didn't earn what I got because I didn't work hard for it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like beating myself up for not getting more because I didn't work hard for the more,
Yeah. So I think this is a really foundational thought that we pick up from like Puritanism and capitalism. So one of the things that helped me with this thought process is like, this didn't come out of nowhere, right? Part of what happens and that coaching helps us with is that we have a thought and then we just like believe it's true, right? So it just seems naturally obvious to you that if you don't work hard for things, then they're not meaningful or they're not valuable, right? You have that thought and you're like, yeah, well, that's true. But those thoughts come from some combination of how we're raised and our social programming and where we went to school and our friends and whatever else. Like people are programming all of our thoughts. And that idea that hard work is virtuous is like a really kind of Puritan idea, I think, comes from a specific Christian tradition. And then it really meshes so well with capitalism also, right? Because the idea that work is productivity is good. So that was one place I started, just to understand where the thought came from, right? Just to see like, oh, maybe this is coming from the culture. It's not just a truth about the world. But in terms of shifting your thoughts, so how do you feel when you think, I haven't worked hard enough?
Well, I mostly frustrated myself for thinking that thought because I logically know, like, it's like hard for me to disassociate what I logically know and how I feel about it. Does that make sense? I logically know that I have worked. It wasn't hard necessarily, but I sat there and I physically read the thing, right? It's not like I did nothing. And the difficulty of it, like, I don't know why I'm placing value on the difficulty of it.
Yeah, well, I think, so that's one of the places that I think coaching sometimes is different from therapy. Like, I don't think we need to know why. I just think we need to know that your brain says hard things are more valuable.
Fair enough.
Right? Like, how do you feel when you think hard things are more valuable?
I don't know that I think hard things are more valuable. I think what I think, oh my gosh, this is getting really, is that it's important to be hardworking. Like there's a value in being hardworking in itself.
Right. And you believe you're not hardworking.
Correct.
Right. So you have two choices there, right? You can do the work to change your thought about working hard being important, or you can do the work to change your thought about you not working hard, right? Because you got yourself caught in a loop where the only way you could allow yourself to believe you work hard is if things were difficult.
Yeah. Turns out it's hard. This is going to sound way more like, I don't mean to sound as braggy, but it's hard for me to find things that are really difficult.
Yeah, well, and then that's going to be a problem for you, right? Because, so I actually think that probably there are things that are difficult for you, but your idea of how difficult something should be is like not proportional.
Fair enough.
So you're like, unless I am like sweating trying to think about this, it's not difficult, right? So I think it's fun. What I did when I was working on this was to really, and especially since you've been coached a lot, right? I don't think we have to start really fundamental. Like, I tried to switch around and play with the idea of like, what if it's awesome that things are easy for me?
Yep.
Like, what if that's cool? What if that's great? What if so many people wish that things were easy for them? And listen, there's a lot of stuff that has been difficult, right? Like, I worked really hard on coaching myself and it was difficult. That doesn't mean that it was like sweat pounding. I didn't understand it, right? But it just meant that like it took a lot of practice and a lot of dedication to change how my brain was wired, especially because I was kind of doing it myself. So I think one thing, if we had like a whole hour and you're my client, I would say, I want you to make a list, but you can still do this and report back to me. Make a list of things that you have. Let's not use the phrase work hard because you don't think you work hard. Let's list a phrase of things that you have put consistent effort to over the years.
No, I think you've completely like hit the nail on the head. I think that that's completely right. And having been coached a lot, I see exactly where this is going. And no, you're completely right. Sorry, now I'm like having like a moment.
Yeah, good. That's what coaching is all about.
Working through it myself. And part of it, and I think about this also when I think about the way I parent my kids and how I want them to think about the work they put in versus the results. Because I know that I don't want them to focus on the results. I do want them to focus on the work and the effort, but I don't want them to get stuck where I'm stuck, where they think the effort has to be hard.
Yeah, you just shifted the baseline for yourself. You were like, oh, I won't be results oriented. I'll be process oriented. Now I'll just beat myself up about the process.
Yeah,
right?
Correct.
Like that didn't really solve your underlying problem, which is commitment to the belief that like you're not good enough.
Yep.
Yeah. So for anybody listening, this is deep coaching. This is not usually what it's like on the first day. You don't have to be afraid if you get on a call with one of us, it's going to be like this right away.
No, this is, I've been getting coached for years, so.
We can go deep. I think for you, this is like, right, this is just a signal pointing back to, there's that fundamental work about worthiness, right? Exactly. Underneath all of this is the belief that you have to be a certain way to be worthy.
Yep, I'm proving my worthiness through my hard work.
Yeah, and then you're like, but none of my work counts as hard. So that's a nice little like situation set up for myself, right? This is the thing about lawyers. Our brains can do really complicated gymnastics to make it seem totally logical. What's going on is like, we're just believing that we have to, Brene Brown calls it hustling for your worthiness, hustling for your worth. So I think that's what's going on, right? You're telling yourself you got to hustle for your worth.
Yep. I love this, and I love this conversation. I actually was listening to I listen to a lot of financial podcasts, and I was listening to one recently where they were talking about an article about early retirement, and one of the commentators made this comment about how he didn't like the whole concept of early retirement because he thought that it set up a bad example for future generations about the value of work. Like, what are we saying to our children if they think you can just stop working at 40 and enjoy the rest of your life? And I remember I got so prickly just listening to it. Mm-hmm. And to your point about it being societal, it really resonates with me. And I'm like putting it all together now. That's why I was feeling so prickly, is because a part of me has succumbed to that idea that I'm supposed to work, and that's how I like prove my worth in society, and that I have to set that example for my kids. But it isn't what I want to believe. And so when I hear other people say it, it kind of annoys me, because like, even when I say it to you, like the idea that you could enjoy the rest of your life, like what, like, why would that be something bad? Like, why is that a bad example for your kids?
Right. It's craziness, but that is what we're taught to think. I just think about how often people talk about like whether they've been productive or unproductive, like on their weekend, right? Like, this is a whole other conversation, but the language of capitalism and you know, I run a business. It's not like I'm not a capitalist in some level, but I do think it's just really useful to think about like who benefits from the idea that I should be working all the time, right?
Absolutely.
Like, why do I believe that my quote unquote free time, like if you have a weekend, the whole purpose of that is to not be working. So why am I constantly thinking about whether I'm being productive enough in my free time, right? Yeah. Humans are not meant to work all the time. That's exhausting. Humans, you know, you have a right to pleasure and relaxation and ease, right? And that's what's so fascinating about this thought you have is like, because you're so interested in coaching, the whole point of all this work is to bring a little more ease into being a human. Right? But then you're like, oh, if I'm experiencing ease, then I'm not worthy.
Yeah. And I think that might be kind of where the rubber hit the road, is I've been getting coaching to the point where now my life is really easy. So I'm like, well, something wrong here.
Yeah, no, celebrate that shit. Every time that like something happens that in the past I would have lost my mind over, and now I feel chill, I'm just like, that's awesome.
Like, right? What? Let's talk about a few of those things. What kinds of things are you now much better at handling?
I just know everything that happens in the whole world. I just was like a very anxious person. And I would have said that I was just very sensitive, which like maybe was true, but so many things. Let's see. My family is a big one, actually, although that's not a professional one. But my relationship with every member of my family is completely different now. And of course, they didn't change at all. I changed. Procrastination, getting work done, was a really big problem for me. I was a lifelong procrastinator. I would have argued to the death that it was like genetic. My mother's a long-time procrastinator, also a lawyer. And I really don't procrastinate anymore, very rarely. And now when I notice it is happening, I know how to change it. So so that's changed. Like, I used to feel a lot of anxiety and dread about doing things, and it didn't have anything to do with it being like law versus coaching. It just had to do with my, you know, beliefs and my own insecurities about what if I failed? What if I didn't do a good job? What would other people think? All that stuff. So my work life is really different. My romantic relationships are really different. My relationship with my partner is much, much better because I am different. Again, he didn't change. There's really no area of my life that has not been kind of revolutionized by this work, I have to say.
It is really amazing work. And you said the F word. So I want to talk about that for just a brief moment, because I love kind of Brene Brown's work on shame, and I think failure is a part of that. And as lawyers, we are particularly, in my experience, sensitive to failure and shame.
Yeah, we are terrified of failure. And we interpret lots of things as failure that are not failure at all.
Correct. Say more about that.
Yeah. So I think I already said this once, but like, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, is actually a really profound truth about how the brain works, right? We know that the brain looks for evidence of whatever you tell it to find, right? So we know there's confirmation bias and kind of selective processing. Your brain has to do that because it just takes in too much information on a daily basis, right? To like process and live. So it has to filter out a lot of stuff. So if you tell your brain what to look for, it will find it. When you are terrified of rejection and you're constantly scanning for it, you will see things or failures. You will see things as failure that aren't failure. So like, I go through this with my clients all the time. Like, you write a draft of a brief and a partner sends it back all marked up. And you experience that as failure, right? You feel ashamed and anxious and like you're failing. When the truth is, that's your job is to write a draft and the partner's job is to mark it up. Nobody has failed here. Both people did their jobs, right? There's no world in which, as a junior associate, you write stuff and nobody ever has a comment on it and nobody ever wants revisions. That world doesn't exist. Nobody else is having that experience. But because you're so terrified of failure, you're looking for that and you'll interpret things as failure that aren't, right? And I do think lawyers are particularly susceptible. Part of it is the disposition of people who go into law, right? There's some studies, I think, showing that they tend to be more kind of anxious already. But also, the first thing that happens when you go to law school is they're basically like, if you ever make a mistake, it might be malpractice, right? You just get like totally freaked out. You're like, oh my God, if I put the money in the wrong account or I miss a case, then that's malpractice. So the stakes get so high. So many of my clients come to me and they're like convinced that if I didn't do a good job on this memo, that's going to eventually mean that I'm going to end up in jail. Like that's what they're thinking. So of course it's like exhausting to try to live that way.
No, that's so right. And one of the reframes that I use in that context is that it's not a critique of me. It's just feedback about them.
Mm-hmm.
So they're just telling me the way I think a bit about it. Kind of school was always my happy place. I was always very good at school, but you always knew that every professor was different and every professor wanted different things. And if you go back as far back as like high school or middle school, do you remember how teachers used to care how you wrote your name on your papers? Was that like a normal thing? And like the first day of school, you would get the syllabus and they would tell you how you should format assignments. And I never saw that as like a critique of the way I would have chosen to do it. You know what I mean?
Right, totally.
I was just like, this is their preference. And so that's how I think about it now when I work with somebody for the first time. I think this is how they're teaching me what they want in my work product.
Yeah. And I mean, law is an art, not a science. So people are going to have different opinions, right? And those don't have to mean anything about you or your work. Totally.
Correct. And as you become more senior, you get to push back more. I think in the beginning it's hard because often, even when you think you have a good case, you're not really in a position to make it.
Yeah, well, that's something I work on with people a lot, actually, is there are times in law firm life where you can't push back, right? Where you can't push back on an argument, you really do have to stay up all night, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think that one of the reasons that especially people who work in big firms are so miserable is that because of the way they've been trained to think, right? Lawyers are very deferential to authority. If you're insecure, you're going to be even more so, right? You just want those gold stars to validate yourself, right? If you're in that mindset, you have no ability to distinguish between the times you can't push back and the times you can, because you are just constantly scrambling, hustling for your worthiness. So that's one of the things I work with people on is like, yeah, let's assume 20% of the time, whatever percentage, you actually do have to stay up all night. You actually have to cancel all your plans. You actually have to work on vacation. That is going to happen. It's why as a 24-year-old, you can get paid that much money, right? That's going to happen. But a lot of the time there is a little more room and you just don't see it and you're not confident enough to like test it and ask for it and see what wiggle room you do have because of the way you're thinking about yourself and authority and everything else.
That's great. I actually have these like 5 principles, like basic fundamental beliefs that I think if you carry, you're going to be miserable in big law. And one of them is the principle that hard work always pays off. And I think that that's what a lot of people go into it thinking is if I just keep my nose down and grind it out, it'll all just pan out. And so they get really annoyed at the person who seems to be working less, but the partners love them and they can't figure out why. Or the people who work really hard and don't ever get, see payoff. And then they think it's law firms. Like law firms are not set up right. They're not rewarding the right people. And what they don't realize is they're just not understanding the system, right? They need to lift their head up and kind of figure out what's actually being rewarded. Because billable hours are the trackable number, people think that that's the only thing they're being judged by.
Yeah, totally.
But it's not a proxy for how well people think you're doing.
Yeah, I totally agree. But I think that's part of what, you get taught to think that way in law school. It's like all of a sudden you're in this homogenous thing that's like, you get this one exam and there's this many grades and this many people can get A's, right? Yep. And there's like this many spots on the law review and there's this many clerkships, so you're getting funneled into everyone competing for the same scarcity, right? You create so much scarcity thinking for lawyers.
Oh my gosh. We're hitting all the big buzzwords.
I know there's so many things that before I was a coach, I was like, oh my God, I would roll my eyes whenever I heard words like, scarcity versus abundance, or like manifestation, Yep. And there are all these things that as I've become a coach, I've had to stop making fun of. Like I used to love making fun of Tony Robbins. Now I can't make fun of him anymore.
I know. I'm exactly the same way. I definitely went through a phase. I remember when I first heard about life coaching and I thought it was like the cheesiest thing I'd ever heard of. Mm-hmm. Until I was like, I need a life coach. Like my life is a disaster right now.
Right. You're like, I think there's someone who works on this. What are they called?
And I swallowed my pride and I did the search and I found one and it was the best decision I've ever made. Before we kind of start to wrap things up, can you just touch really briefly on the scarcity mindset? We've talked about it previously on the show, but I think it's a while since I've touched on it. And I know that having a scarcity mindset is definitely, like when you think about job opportunities, when you think about just opportunity in general, it's something lawyers really struggle with.
Yeah, absolutely. So for people who are not immersed in the life coaching lingo, right? Scarcity is what it sounds like. It's the belief that there's like not enough out there for you, right? Sometimes you believe there's not enough out there for anyone, and sometimes you just believe there's not enough out there for you. And that could be anything, right? Like it can be people to date, it can be jobs, it can be money, it can be food, it can be anything. And I think that lawyers get really inculcated into a scarcity mindset by the process of going through law school. Like, I mean, for me at least, so I went to a fancy law school. I went to Harvard, and part of the whole reason you go to a place like that is they really, when they recruit you, they're like, people come from all over the world with all these different experiences. Our class is full of people who have done such interesting things. And then you get there and they're like, forget all of that. You are all now competing for the same 4 jobs. Right? So you go through this process where you're getting funneled into kind of competing for limited spots, and you get these blinders put on you so that you sort of, by the time you graduate, you're like, there's only 2 options in life. I could go to a law firm, or I could become a nonprofit impact litigator. Like those are the only 2 things I could do. And so I think that narrowing of vision and that sense of scarcity, that you're always competing for slots that aren't enough. Only a certain number of people can make law review. Only a certain number of people can get a clerkship. Only a certain number of people can get a fellowship. Like the year that I was a reproductive rights fellow, that was the only reproductive rights fellowship in the country. You're really sort of funneled and narrowing down in that way. And that creates the sense that there's just not enough to go around. And then I think that really combines with all of the inadequacy issues and all the catastrophizing issues. And so lawyers become so risk averse, right? And so they don't even want to look for another job as a lawyer or not. They can't really think bigger about what else they might do in their lives. And I don't coach people to leave the law. A lot of my clients really want to be lawyers. They just don't want to be so miserable. But if you do want to be able to leave, that's something you should at least be able to think about without just being, assuming that it won't work and there's nothing else out there for you.
Amen. And I want your advice on one last thing, because it's something I've been turning over in my head, and I think you might have an answer to it. What is the best way for us to think about kind of women in the law and people of color in the law? Because there is, I don't want to use the word scarcity, but
yeah, there is discrimination that exists. It's a fact in the world.
But it's not even the discrimination. It is the discrimination. I just don't know how to have these conversations without focusing on the negative. Mm-hmm. And, the articles that come out and the conversations that are being had are always about kind of highlighting how little has changed or how few women are in, positions of power, how few, Black students are getting into law schools, et cetera, et cetera. But I believe in the power of language and I believe in the power of perspective. Mm-hmm. So I believe there must be a way for us to talk about these things and think about these things that isn't just focused on the negative and the scarcity. What are your thoughts?
That's interesting.
Do you think it even matters? Maybe it doesn't matter.
Yeah, what comes to mind, and then you can tell me if this is directed at the point you're trying to make. I think that one of the reasons that these efforts haven't worked is that we're trying to reform the firm structure, but we're not dealing with the mindset of all the people going through it, right? So you can, and that's not, and I do not mean that in a it's the victim's fault way. It's nobody's fault, right? We just are not like, I think we should all be taught in first grade how to manage our minds, right? We're not. So when you interact with a world in which there is bias, there is discrimination, you don't have the tools to try to deal with it. And so when we're trying to reform, like law firms, we're trying to create some space in an institution. But when people are suffering from so much of their own negative thinking and dealing with whatever trauma or experiences they've had, like creating that space is only half the battle. So to me, like, I think sometimes one of the objections to mindset work is that it's like you're telling people not to care about racism or sexism, or, or like that we don't have to fix that stuff. You just think positively. And it's not about that at all. But to me, teaching women and teaching people of color and teaching marginalized people how to control their own thinking and develop more coping and resiliency skills is actually what's liberating and empowering. Like, I became a more confident feminist woman from doing this thought work on myself, not less. It didn't make me not notice sexism or not care about it. It like gave me a coping and resiliency tool to deal with it when I encountered it, so that it did not just sort of flatten me. And that means that I have more resources for the fight. It's like when I coach people on social justice, it's like, you can totally continue thinking about how terrible the situation is. The only problem is that it's burning you out to think that way. And you have the belief that if you didn't focus on the terribleness of it, you wouldn't be motivated to change it. And I don't think that's true at all. And I think that focusing on the negative constantly just physically produces, like, burnout is not just a mental state. It is a physical state produced by constant cortisol and adrenaline and chronic stress in your body. And if you want to be able to fight the good fight, learning how to care for yourself by managing your mind so that you are not constantly focusing on the negative will actually give you more energy for those efforts. It'll help you think in more creative and strategic ways. And I think that's true whether you're litigating abortion rights or whether you're, on the professional development committee of a major law firm trying to make space for more women partners. Does that get at your question? I'm not sure if that was...
Absolutely. And there's so many things in there that I would love to dive into if we had more time, but definitely gave me a lot to mull over, because it's definitely something I struggle with, because in the position that I'm in now, I'm often asked to speak on these things. And to your point about not wanting to make it seem like victim blaming, I do advocate for radical responsibility in your life. And walking that line can be challenging. So definitely gave me lots to think about. And I'm sure there's a lot more conversations that can be had around this topic. But I want to give you time to talk a little bit about kind of what you have going on in your coaching practice with your podcast and how people can learn more about you and what you're up to.
Yeah, great. So I have a podcast. You can check it out, the Lawyer Stress Solution Podcast. It's exactly what it sounds like. I teach you how to use coaching tools and how to learn how to manage your thoughts and your feelings to deal with various stressors of being a lawyer. So that's on iTunes. And if you have an Android, you can get it through Stitcher or any of the other kind of podcast apps. And then if you want to find more information about me, you can check out also online, thelawyerstresssolution.com is my podcast website. And then my coaching website is redesignyourmind.com. And I do one-on-one coaching, I do small group coaching, and I also work with firms and institutions. So if anyone listening is at a law firm and thinks that this kind of coping and resiliency tools would be helpful, I work institutionally. Mostly I focus on teaching coping and resiliency skills to women, since women tend to, along with people of color, other marginalized groups, tend to leave the practice of law at a higher rate. So teaching sort of thought and feeling management and stress reduction and coping tools so that those who want to stay in the practice can do it and don't have that kind of burnout that forces them to leave.
If you haven't heard her podcast, definitely check it out. It's phenomenal. So many of my listeners have reached out about it and think it's a really great resource. So if you're not already listening, you should definitely add it to your list. Thank you so much, Kara, for being a part of the project today and sharing your story here with us. Before I let you go, I just want to ask you one last question, which I ask everybody who comes on the show. And that is, what do you think is the key to what separates lawyers who are happy from lawyers who struggle to find happiness in life with a law degree?
Knowing how to manage your mind is the secret to life for anyone of any profession. That's my bottom line.
Amen. Well, thank you so much, Kara. Apologies.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, really. I've loved this conversation, and I hope it's not our last one.
Thank you for joining me for the Happy Lawyer Project podcast. Please head over to my website, www.thehappylawyerproject.com, for more information from today's show. While you're there, I'd love it if you'd leave me your thoughts on the show. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn, Facebook, or follow me on Instagram. If you've enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. And don't forget to head over to iTunes to subscribe and review the show. As you know, each rating helps more listeners find the show and helps me get awesome guests on here for you guys. If there's anyone you'd like me to have on the show, or if you'd like to be on the show, head over to my website and let me know, or send me an email at Okoma, OKEOMA, at thehappylawyerproject.com. A special thanks to everyone who's left a review, sent me an email, or reached out to me in any way. I appreciate you. Thank you again for spending this time with me, and if you would like to learn more about working in your gift and living your passion, head over to the website for a free gift. Until next time, bye!